Dark Souls 1 was a really good game. I still think it's the worst of the three. I feel like a lot of people look back on it with nostalgia. It's leveled. The interconnectedness is cool. It's a cool thing. But like it's not the only level design is not the only selling point of a game. You know, actual gameplay mechanics also, in fact, they play a bigger role, believe it or not. And this game's, granted, it doesn't have the worst mechanics.
Dude, Dark Souls 1 got the atmosphere the best. What atmosphere? Like, yeah, I'm sure this game would have good atmosphere if I could see it. Like, damn, bro, this is some good atmosphere right here. Put a pin in everything you just heard, and we'll get back to it. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, ghouls and ghosts. To clarify, this video is not made with the intention of having a go at anyone, and believe it or not, I'm not doing this with the intention of starting a war. I'm doing this because I love this series, and I think it's important to acknowledge the flaws in it. Besides, I've already put this video off for way too long now, who knows. If you guys like it, I might do a discussion video like this for the other Souls games. Dark Souls 1 is an expertly crafted third-person action RPG, which focuses heavily on challenging, gritty combat and exploration. It is most well known for its difficult gameplay, which demands high reaction time, dedication and, most importantly, perseverance, but I would argue that it is so much more than that. Dark Souls 1 boasts a wonderfully interconnected fantasy world filled with a wide variety of unique areas for the player to explore to their own content. From the deep, dark depths of the catacombs, to the ancient, ruined civilization of Lost Isleth, and to the grandiose, golden city of Anor Londo, this game has a plethora of unique, wonderfully designed areas for the player to uncover over the course of their 60-hour playthrough, and by God is that 60 hours well worth it. Now, there are a lot of things to talk about with this game, from the challenging and very rewarding combat to the amazing leveling system that allows the player to create and define his or her own unique build with relative ease. But if I were to summarize what I personally think this game does best, that is how I would do it. Now, I won't lie to you. Originally, this video was going to be titled something very different. I originally intended this discussion to be about why I feel Dark Souls 1 is the worst Souls game, but recently I've had a bit of a change of heart. Dark Souls 1 is not the worst Souls game, that title does and will always belong to the original Demon Souls. And despite my completely irrational love towards Dark Souls 2, I cannot deny the fact that the game is deeply, deeply flawed, both as a Dark Souls game and a video game in general. Now, I love this franchise almost as much as my friends and family, and believe me when I say that none of these games are objectively bad by video game standards. Flawed, yes, but not bad enough that I would feel the need to make a video bashing on them, and it's for that very reason that the original objective of this video has changed. Dark Souls 1 is not a bad game. It's a fantastic game that deserves to be celebrated as much as it is already in the gaming community. In fact, I would argue very strongly that I believe this game deserves far more praise than it already gets. I never meant to come across as though I thought otherwise. That being said, this game is by no means a masterpiece, as many people have stated over the years. I wholeheartedly believe that statement could be made for Dark Souls 3, but even then that would be pushing it considering that game still contains many of the staple issues which riddle the Souls series, such as the janky hitboxes, and on top of that, it is still extremely linear compared to the previous games, a change which, while praised by some, was not accepted by many. But this video is on Dark Souls 1, so let's talk about that game. Today I come to you with a different argument to ones I have made numerous times in the past. Dark Souls 1 is not a masterpiece, and today I'm going to talk about why. Brilliantly crafted game that it is, it has flaws, and this video exists for the sole purpose of pointing out those flaws. However, I want to make it very clear from the get-go that no matter how my jokes come across, and no matter how passive-aggressive towards the game I may seem in this video, I never want my points to be interpreted as Dark Souls 1 is bad, or Dark Souls 2 is better, because that would be lying. If I compare it to the other games at any point, I'm not doing it to make it seem like this game is bad, because the others are better. What is most likely the case is that I feel those games may do something a bit better, or slightly less bad. I may feel as though one of the later games added something unique and fresh, or that they expanded upon a previous mechanic in a really good way. I do not ever ever want my points to be interpreted as Dark Souls 1 is bad because it did one thing slightly less good. Believe it or not, but these are all drastically different games with drastically different strengths. Just because one game improved on a pre-established mechanic does not devalue the original game as a whole. That is a stupid assumption to make. Now, hopefully, most of you didn't need that little clarification, but I felt I would include it regardless, since I know how defensive Dark Souls fans can be of their favourite games. That's not a bash in any way, shape or form, it is simply an observation. I'm much the same with Dark Souls 3. It is more than okay to fiercely defend something you feel passionate about. I really love how everyone has their own opinions on what makes these games great, whether it's the bosses, the areas, the PvP, or even if it's just because of Guinevere's tits, because believe me, we've all been there. You all have something that you love about this series, but similar to how it's good to defend something you care about, it is also sometimes good to acknowledge something's flaws, as it will likely strengthen your overall enjoyability of said thing by making the aspects in which it already does well even better. In case it wasn't obvious already, that's what I'm doing today. So, with the nitty gritty out of the way, I think it's finally time to descend into the game of Dark Souls once more, this time with the newly found purpose of pointing out a few minor issues, as well as some major ones which I'll be sure to point out along the way.
That's ridiculous, though. The fact that, like, it's such a long run of a boss fight, right? But your souls stay, like, depending on how far you ran the last time before you died. So, like, considering that this boss fight can literally just go, like, if you get unlucky like I'm getting, it can go literally infinitely long.
So I want to start off with the most common criticism one could make about this game, which coincidentally is also the easiest one to argue. That argument being that the second half of the game is unfinished and full of design flaws. I find it very interesting that when people praise this game, they rarely mention the second half, and when they do, it's often brushed off as a minor nitpick that one can possibly, maybe on an off day, make about the game. This is not true. If you're trying to paint Dark Souls 1 as a masterpiece, completely ignoring the bad half of the game is not the way to go about it. That is manipulative. You need to look at both sides of the argument, in this case explain to me why Lost Izalith is not as terrible as people really think. You'll have a difficult time doing that, but I believe that it is still in the realm of possibility. But if you pretend that a large chunk of this game simply didn't happen by choosing to never talk about it, then that's obviously going to paint the impression that Dark Souls 1 is greater than it actually is. This is of course because the second half of the game is shit. Okay, maybe not shit, but it's definitely flawed in a multitude of ways. If you think I'm exaggerating, I'm really not. Let's get some minor frustrations out the way before I tackle the big boy issues. Now, I think it goes without saying that the second half of Dark Souls 1 lacks considerably in quality in comparison to its first half, and it is riddled with frustrating design decisions that reduce the overall enjoyability of the game. These design decisions range from the slightly annoying, like the unhittable ghost in Yolanda, who for some reason are also granted the ability to hit you from behind walls,
what is this area, man?
to the downright dirty design decisions, such as how you literally need to be killed by Seath in order to progress the game, putting both your souls and humanity at risk, with the fun little added bonus that you could be cursed in the process and lose half your health bar. Was I wrong? Nope, I wasn't. You actually do lose your souls. Like my face. Who honestly thought this was a good idea? The player shouldn't be expected to die and put things at risk in order to progress the main story. The proper way to implement this would be to have the player die and wake up somewhere different without losing any resources. It's an incredibly easy fix, so easy in fact that it baffles me why they didn't just do it like that. But what we get instead is a situation where if you happen to die before retrieving your souls, which for the first time player is entirely in the realm of possibility, then that's not what you call a get good moment, that's what you call horseshit. Also, invisible bridges. Why? I think I've said enough about that one. The second half of Dark Souls is riddled with these poor design decisions. Here's another example. When you drop down into Nito's boss room, you take full damage. Now, I've never died to this, but I sure hope they put something in place to make sure that you don't. I don't think they did, though, because that would imply that they were aware of it in the first place, which if they are, I'd be very worried, because if they did know about it, why didn't they do anything about it? This is a boss fight, for God's sake. The biggest detriment to my health bar should not be coming from me simply entering the room. Now, I could, of course, go on and on, listing every single minor frustration one could have, but I would argue that these are things that can be looked past. The reason why I mention these problems at all in the first place is to demonstrate to you that even though they're small, these problems still exist. While on their own, these things don't pose much of an issue. A large large collective of design flaws like these can really ruin an experience. But yes, overall these things can be frustrating to deal with for sure, but on the whole they're very minor nitpicks that you can only really have if they happen to be of detriment to you. Unfortunately, just like your mama, there are some things that cannot be looked past. One such thing is the abhorrent design decision to make the Tomb of the Giants the most accurate video game representation of driving a car blindfolded since 1993. There are two types of Dark Souls 1 players, those that despise running through this area for the first time, and liars. Believe it or not, From Software, but the ability to see where you're going and what you are fighting is something that's pretty integral to an action RPG. What is that?! Ah, yes. Let's make an enemy that can one-shot you in an instant, except you'll never be able to dodge the attack because the area is too dark to see anything. Brilliant level design From Software. You know something else that no sane Dark Souls player enjoys? Lost Izalith. Between the copy-pasted enemies, the flaws that lack any sort of collision boxes causing players to fall through them, and the overall lack of any warpable bonfires, this area is so unfinished it could give Fallout 76 a run for its money. It takes less than 2 seconds of being in this piss-ridden shithole of an area to notice just how pressed for time the developers were when making this. Believe me, I would rather not waste everybody's time talking about Lost Izalith, because literally everybody who has ever finished this game knows just how shit this area is. It is abhorrent, and anyone who treats it otherwise enjoys cock and ball torture. I'm just saying, there is a correlation between the two. And don't even get me started on the bed of chaos.
Ever since PS3,
Yeah.
like all day.
Oh my god, I love that, man. Believe me when I say that there shouldn't be any need for me to draw your attention to some of the problems this area has, but I'm gonna do it anyway because I find it funny. First of all, 10 out of 10 enemy placement From Software, they're not even facing different directions. Also, what the fuck are these things doing here? They're not demons, they're clearly dragons, we've seen them before, not only that, but it's only their bottom halves? Hello? Miyazaki, were you taking crack again? You should probably not do that, it's very bad for your health. Not only is this area terrible from a design standpoint, but some of the visual aspects are also vomit-inducing. Tomb of the Giants may remove your ability to see in the game, but Lost Izalith makes you blind in real life, because for some god-awful reason, somebody decided to make the lava brighter than the fucking sun. The remaster supposedly fixed the brightness issue, but I fail to see how making it look like melted cheese fixes anything. It's just one repeated texture for fucking miles. Who made this? No, seriously, black borders top and bottom, white text along the bottom of the screen, who did this? Now, I'm not saying that the entirety of Dark Souls 1 is bad because of a few bad areas. I mean, there's more than a few, but whatever. For the moment, let's just humor the idea that like 6 shitty areas equals a few. The first half of the game, believe it or not, is actually good. Or maybe even great, depending on what mood I'm in. If we were to judge Dark Souls 1 solely on the first half and the DLC, then it's a really good game. A masterpiece? Probably not, but I would say that there is a very strong argument to be made there. But you cannot actively avoid the underwhelming and objectively flawed parts of this game and call it a masterpiece, because masterpiece implies that the whole game in its entirety, including Izalith, including Tomb of the Giants, including Demon Ruins, including New Londo Ruins, etc., etc. Calling it a masterpiece implies that these massively underdeveloped areas are close to perfection, which they really aren't, and you know that they aren't. That's the worst part. If you're new to my channel, then you most likely won't know this, but Dark Souls 3 was the first Souls game that I ever played, so naturally some of my issues with Dark Souls 1 are going to stem from that. To this day, Dark Souls 3 is still my favourite game of all time, so by far the biggest shock for me when I went back and played Dark Souls 1 for the first time was how the movement felt. I want to preface this by saying that just because I prefer Dark Souls 3's movement, I am not going to sit here and tell you that it is better, because everybody has their own preference. Just know that I will be making some comparisons between the games. Alright. I know you're waiting for it, so let's get it out of the way. Dark Souls 1 is slow and clunky. Yeah, it's almost like that's the point. You can take issue with that stance, but it is true. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing, but the observation that the game is slow and clunky compared to the other games is correct. And I don't like people telling me otherwise. Many make the point that this is a good thing, and that the clunkiness of the movement in this game really makes it feel like you're being weighed down by your armor and your heavy weaponry, and I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I bet you didn't expect that. This is a feeling that I felt was missing in Dark Souls 3, as even when wearing an armor set as heavy as Havel's, I would be swinging my blade around as if I was wearing nothing. However, Just because I feel like this was missing does not mean that I think Dark Souls 3 would benefit from it. It's clear that that game was meant to be much more fast-paced than the previous Dark Souls games, and the clunkiness would not have fit at all, but for Dark Souls 1, I would definitely have to agree that it works in the game's favour. So, you may ask, why am I complimenting Dark Souls 1 when this video is meant to be acknowledging the flaws? Here's the thing. The whole weighed down feeling that Dark Souls 1 gives is really great. Sometimes, a lot of the time, this slow gameplay works to the game's benefit, but I also found there to be a lot of times where I would get increasingly more and more frustrated with the clunkiness.
Fuck. Why? Why are there pillars if he could just go around them?
Yes, this is partially to do with the fact that I was far more accustomed to the easily forgiving gameplay of Dark Souls 3, but that wasn't the only reason. So let's talk about rolling, shall we? First of all, omnidirectional rolling when locked onto enemies. Where is it? I'm holding diagonal now and it's just like, nah, you're rolling at them, right? Yeah. Dark Souls 2's movement is the most scuffed thing I've ever seen, but at least that game let you roll in more than 4 fucking directions. And no, you cannot use the argument that you can just not lock on. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. The lock-on feature is specifically there in the first place so that you can target an enemy to make it easier to fight them. But doing this hinders your movement to the point where your rolling is locked into only 4 directions? This is an issue, and a pretty major one at that, since it practically affects you at all stages of the game. Please stop pretending that this isn't that bad. This clip right here is the perfect example of what I'm saying. So ignoring the fact that I completely screw up dodging the arrow, my goal here is to roll towards this nerdler at a slight diagonal, so that I end up here. However, Dark Souls 1 will not allow me to do that because it's allergic to the fundamentals of movement mechanics, so instead I go hurtling off into the fucking unknown. Now thankfully there was a wall there to stop me from rolling any further, because otherwise I would have taken a little unintentional tumble off the roof of this building. You know what mechanic really grinds my gears in this game? The weight ratio. Now, the purpose of this mechanic has remained the same throughout all the Dark Souls games. The point of the equip load system is to provide the player a choice. Should I give up my movement for better defense, or should I give up good defense in favor of a much faster roll? I'm in no way saying this is bad at all. In fact, in the later games, I think this mechanic is executed really well, but not in this game. So there's a system in the Dark Souls franchise in which once your equip weight reaches a certain percentile, you'll become encumbered enough to where your roll is significantly worse. The roll is slower, the recovery is slower, and you have far less invincibility frames. This is called fat rolling, and believe me when I say that it makes the games far less enjoyable. The game becomes significantly harder, and your movement feels like shit. Now, I have no issue with this feature. It makes perfect sense that the heavier you are, the slower you become. You sacrifice your evasion in favor of tankiness. My issue with equip load in Dark Souls 1 is that fat rolling begins way too low. In both Dark Souls 2 and 3, the required weight to roll normally is under 70%, and thank God they changed it to that. It opens up so much more player freedom to wear what they want without being overly affected by it. In Dark Souls 1, you start fat rolling after exceeding 50%. Why? Who did this? Fashion Souls has never been so shit. So, what exactly is the big problem here? Well, the fundamental issue is that because the state of fat rolling is so utterly undesirable in this game to any player with a brain, all build diversity in relation to your equip load is basically thrown out the window. Not only is there a necessity to stay under that ridiculously low bar of 50%, but players who rely on rolling as their primary method of avoiding attacks will often find normal rolling isn't enough, instead opting for the fast roll that occurs below 25%. This practically makes endurance a must-have for any build. Not only does it increase stamina, that alone making it a very desirable stat to invest into, but it also increases equip load, and since the mechanic of heavy rolling is arguably the biggest detriment to the player in the entire game, it goes without saying that endurance is far more valuable when compared to a bit of extra damage or some extra health. What we're fundamentally left with then is a stat so powerful in comparison to all others that it practically eliminates all elements of choice in relation to leveling up, which completely goes against the whole selling point of an RPG. For many people, they're not going to have access to a lot of their build until very late into the game, because they were basically required to pump all of their early levels into endurance, just to have the luxury of being able to play the game without the sudden urge to throw the controller across the living room. So, how would I fix this? It's simple, just change up the numbers a bit. that's what they did for Dark Souls 3, and it worked wonders. But if you were to ask me, the game that does equip load the best is Dark Souls 2, by a fucking mile. DS2 still has those percentage changes that determine how many invincibility frames your roll gets, but the distance covered by your roll scales incrementally as well. I realized that was a lot of words. I apologize. Here, I'll break it down for you. What that means is that everything from 26% to 69% equip weight will give you the same amount of invincibility frames, but the roll itself will still be a lot better the lower your equip weight is. Hey, I didn't know this at the time, but apparently it also affects your stamina recovery, which is pretty fucking neat if you ask me. So 26% is still better than 69%, even if the invincibility frames stay the same. That being said, you don't even have to do that. Just change the fat rolling percentile from 50% to 70% like the other games. Congratulations From Software, you just improved build diversity and increased the overall enjoyability of your game by changing a single fucking digit. Okay, so far we've discussed 4 things in full. I've talked at length about the various design flaws present throughout the second half of Dark Souls 1, as well as the buggy, lazy, and unfinished areas like Lost Izalith. On top of this, we've also discussed the movement and equip weight systems, and I explained my reasonings as to why I believe the handling of them is problematic, as well as how From Software could have fixed them. You know, if they actually bothered to make a real remaster, unlike the fake one that we received all those many moons ago. Still to come are the joys of build diversity, or lack thereof, the horrors of lemonade chugging, and my personal problem with the big baddies of the game. However, I realize that we are quite a hefty length into what is likely going to be a very long video, so I'm going to leave this as a natural intermission point for you to pause the video, go get a drink, think about what I've said thus far, and type your hopefully constructive comment below stating any possible grievances you may have with the points I've made so far. See you gamers after the break. Alright, so I think it's finally time to talk about the Estus Flask, but before I do, I want to make sure we're all on the same page once again. Just because I'm about to criticize the healing in Dark Souls 1 does not mean I think the other games' healing systems were amazing, because believe me, they had flaws too, but for now, just know that I'll be making some comparisons to the other games, because the fact of the matter is that there were a lot of things that the later games did better in regards to its healing mechanics. In Dark Souls 1, the Estus Flask is your greatest resource, and it is your only way of sustaining life between bonfires. Because of this, it should naturally be a risky item to use when in the heat of combat, but there's a certain point where things stop being risky and just become downright unfun. I unfortunately found the healing in Dark Souls 1 to be just that. Now, first of all, the act of healing is so goddamn unenjoyable. Healing should be risky, you're right, but it shouldn't feel like a chore. In Dark Souls 3, you can't move around much, but you can at least move. It's such a slight difference that in the long run doesn't change much, because if you stop to heal in Dark Souls 3, you're not less likely to get hit than you would be in Dark Souls 1. But the big difference here is that keeping a slight bit of maneuverability when healing feels good. Even if it doesn't accomplish much more than standing still, it still gives you a greater feeling of control, which I would argue feels much less frustrating than the alternative found in Dark Souls 1. Your character literally freezes, takes 5 seconds to down a full pint of piss water, and then you have to wait for him to put the flask back in his fucking pants. I don't know about you, but when I'm drinking something, I don't suddenly lose the ability to move my legs. Dark Souls 2 also does this with the Estus Flask, but I would argue that it is more forgivable here because unlike the first game, Dark Souls 2 has other primary methods of healing like life gems, which do allow you to move around a little when using. Now, for clarification, I'm in no way saying that life gems are a good mechanic. I'm more than aware how broken those things are when it comes to balance, but the fact of the matter is that they complemented the slower and riskier healing of the Estus Flask rather nicely. And honestly, if they weren't so easy to obtain, then I think they would have been a very welcome mechanic. I would also argue that there are many flaws with the way the healing mechanics in Dark Souls 1 are handled as a whole. First of all, 5 flasks to me seems a bit much for the first area, but whatever. This is the first game in the series, so I can forgive it for being a little easier with its tutorial levels. However, that doesn't change the fact that healing is supposed to be a precious resource, and it should be treated as such. This is why I feel the kindling mechanic is fundamentally awful from a design standpoint. Now, in every other game in the franchise, you have to properly earn your Estus by exploring the world. This rewards players for exploration and also means that developers can manage the maximum amount of heals a player has for a certain stage in the game. But in Dark Souls 1, it's entirely in the realm of possibility for you to have all 20 Estus flasks before the Taurus demon. Humanity is an incredibly common resource considering its power as an item, and the only other thing you would need is the Rite of Kindling, which is dropped from fucking Pinwheel of all bosses. Balance. Have you heard of it, Dark Souls 1? As for increasing the power of the Estus flask, I don't have much of a problem with Firekeeper Souls. It's certainly more unique than just having another collectible item like Undead Bone Shards. However, I would have preferred it if there were more creative ways of getting them, because while it's cool that some are obtained through quests or through killing certain NPCs, most of them are still just obtained by picking them up in the world. If you're going to have innovative ways of collecting them, then at least go the full way and really double down on it, because it feels a hell of a lot more impactful obtaining a Firekeeper Soul from killing Quaylag's sister than it does picking it up at the bottom of a fucking sewer. Finally, we have humanity. Granted, this argument applies more to experienced players, but once you know how to obtain humanity easily, I feel as though it invalidates the Estus Flask almost entirely. At its core, humanity is an infinitely farmable resource that grants a full heal upon use. Not only that, but the player can hold up to 99 at any given time, twice that if you include twin humanities. Naturally, at this stage, it's fairly easy to argue that healing is no longer a precious resource, which is a fundamental problem when your entire game is designed and balanced around that fact. So I think by far the biggest problem I seem to have with the original Dark Souls has always been the lack of build diversity. Typically when people talk about build diversity in Dark Souls, they're thinking about it in regards to PvP. Now, obviously build diversity is a huge part of the PvP scene of these games, but as far as my experience with the Souls series is concerned, I know very little about the PvP scene, especially that found in Dark Souls 1. From what I have experienced from playing with friends in the occasional invasion, I can say that I didn't enjoy it as much as the other two games, but I can provide very little evidence in regards to its overall quality. Besides, I think PvP has its ups and downs no matter what Souls game you're playing, so for the sake of sticking to things I know comfortably well, I will not be covering PvP in this video. Instead, this section will focus on things I found to be super broken in terms of PvE balance, as well as a few design decisions that I felt drastically reduced the overall build quality in this game. I would argue that one of the most important parts of any build is the rings you use. Rings grant slight power-ups, which by themselves are usually pointless. However, when combined with the rest of your gear, as well as other ring combinations, they can be super imperative to a build. Some increase scaling, some give raw stats, and sometimes they grant an entirely unique ability like lifesteal, better rolling, regeneration, etc. For anybody who hasn't played the first Dark Souls, you would likely be shocked that the original ring slots a player is allowed is not 4 like the other games, but in fact it's half of that. I'm sorry, but that's not enough slots. Obviously rings are not the only part of a build, but the small buffs that they grant are also so important to defining a build. Now normally only 2 ring slots wouldn't be that big of an issue, as rings are much stronger in Dark Souls compared to the later games. It just means you have to be smarter about the rings you choose, but let's be honest here, 9 times out of 10 you're going to be wearing the same rings, and one of those rings is likely always going to be the Ring of Favor and Protection. It's just a really good, well-rounded tool in your arsenal, thanks to the fact that it increases health, stamina, and equip weight. 3 stats that almost every build is probably going to want to include. Oh, and it breaks when you remove it for some god-awful reason. Because of this seemingly random design decision, it usually means that once you put it on, chances are that baby is staying there for the rest of your playthrough. So congratulations, you now only have 1 ring slot. 1 single ring to make the difference between a strength build and a magic build, the difference between a heavy hitting build or a fast build. So what are you going to put there? What ring are you going to choose? Remember, this decision is very important, so don't— oh wait, I forgot this is Dark Souls 1, the game where equip weight sucks anti to cock and rolling feels like rubbing your feet on a rusted cheese grater. Alright, So your wide range of choices has now diminished to a grand total of 2 options, Havel's Ring or Ninja Flip Ring. Or you could level up endurance to level 60, either way you sacrifice a part of your build, so what does it matter? Okay, I'm sorry. That was a very generalized point, and that is not really the way to do arguments. Obviously, there are a lot of people out there that use other rings. I'm not denying that. There are lots of rings in this game, but ultimately so many of them have abilities that are just so inconsequential that you would be hesitant to run them to begin with. For example, you would have to kill 30 enemies without taking any damage in order for the evil eye ring to heal you as much as a single Estus flask would. Comparing that to 2 rings that practically double your defensive stats, well, it's sad to say that there's not much of a competition. Due to how I prefer to play these games, I find myself unable to play Dark Souls 1 without resorting to one of those aforementioned ring combinations. This is a huge problem for build diversity that's ultimately caused by matchless power balancing as well as a distinct lack of ring slots. Your options are limited, and your viable options are limited even further, and since the ability to create a unique and interesting build is one of the selling points of an RPG, these limitations in build diversity are also limiting in regards to the game itself. Speaking quite frankly, I think the second half of Dark Souls 1 handles the difficulty of its areas and bosses very poorly, and for this section I just want to quickly explain why that is. As mentioned previously, the second half of this game lacks considerably in quality compared to the first. This is in part due to rushed level and boss design likely caused by time constraints, but I find the drop in quality can also be attributed to how the second half of the game is structured as a whole. After obtaining the cereal bowl, the player is given the option of 4 potential paths to follow, each path being home to one of the 4 holders of the Lord Soul. Seath in the Library, the 4 or 5 kings in the not-so-new looking New Londo, Nito in the place where the lights are turned off, and the Bed of Chaos in the place where the lights are a little bit too bright. You can do these 4 in any order that you see fit, which is not a bad thing on its own. The problem with this is less to do with the concept itself, but in how this newfound level of player freedom is handled. Later games in the series have done this very same branching path approach to level structure, but in this game I would argue that it didn't work nearly as well for one primary reason. All of these areas were designed to be approached first. The developers clearly wanted any player to pick any area first and have it be a natural step up in difficulty from Anor Londo. The obvious problem with this is, well, only one of these areas can truly be approached first. Now, sure, you can go to any of these 4 at any point, but once you finish one of those areas and defeat your first lord, you would have likely acquired enough souls and items to make the remaining 3 much easier. And this sudden gap between enemy strength and the strength of the player only gets wider with each subsequent lord slain. Obviously, this creates a problem between the balance of difficulty across these areas. Typically, the first location you pick will be the hardest for that playthrough, and by the 4th and final lord, the game has all but lost that sense of challenge that it's so highly praised for having. I think a very good alternative to this is offered to us by From Software's newest game, Elden Ring, in which you still have the freedom of going wherever, whenever you like, but the areas are still designed to ideally be approached in some sort of chronological order. Sure, it's entirely possible for you to skip straight to Mogul Rykard before you even enter Stormveil Castle, but beating them is going to be insanely difficult in comparison to the alternative. I'm not saying Dark Souls 1 should have executed it to this scale, but at least they should have had a recommended order. Let's imagine a world where Seath is expected to be approached first, and Nito last. Suddenly a player's choice becomes so much more impactful to the experience. Now I could simply follow the recommended path and go to the Grand Archives first, progressing through a challenge that is designed for my current level. Alternatively, I could still go straight to the Tomb of the Giants the same way I always could, however now the enemies are scaled for a level I am yet to reach. It's still doable in a way that makes the freedom of choice fun and enjoyable, but it removes the problem of the endgame having this stagnant, unchanging difficulty between its levels. Not only does this approach to game design have a negative impact on difficulty, but it also has an effect on exploration. If a player no longer feels resistance in their progression, then it lowers the incentive for them to explore the areas thoroughly. After all, the benefit to exploring in these games is finding secrets and items that could potentially offer an advantage. If a player no longer feels a need to grow stronger, there's a higher chance they will also stop feeling the need to explore and find items. Boss fights are for me the best thing about this franchise. Well-designed fights that challenge the player's skill in a fun, intuitive and engaging way are something that the Souls games have never failed to provide us with. Although some games in the series may overall have more great boss fights than others, that doesn't mean that those others did not have their strong points either. That all being said, the base game of Dark Souls 1 contains within it a distinct lack of great boss fights. There are a few noteworthy fights sprinkled throughout it here and there, but comparing it to many of its later successors, this game leaves you wanting for intuitive and engaging fights. I suppose the Bed of Chaos could be considered a better place to start than any.
Let me explain Bed of Chaos. Imagine you're playing Minecraft and you go on Hypixel to get bitches. And there's a homeless parkour and you're like, alright, I'm going this. But every single jump is a fence, and if you fall off, it bans you from the server.
This doesn't even deserve to be called a boss fight. It's a platforming minigame in the middle of an action RPG that doesn't even give you a fair chance of beating it. As if the concept of avoiding giant pitfalls that suddenly appear under your feet wasn't difficult enough in a game where there isn't a proper jumping mechanic. But the Bed of Chaos's primary way of attacking is by sliding its cock along the ground and sweeping you into these holes before you even get a chance to react. While we're here, let's talk about the other lords. After all, these are supposed to be the special fights, a checklist of big climactic battles that every player must tick off before the game is over. The Four Kings is a particularly offensive fight in my eyes. I'll never understand how the same game that made Ornstein and Smo one of the best examples of a gank fight done right can then go on to make a gank fight as abhorrent as this one. The Four Kings aren't a boss fight, they're a glorified DPS test in a game about being patient and waiting for the right opening to attack. Dark Souls is not a game built for a DPS test. I'm sorry, it just isn't. God forbid you're using a slow strength weapon, because the longer you take to kill one of these losers, the more of them show up. This is a 4v1 gank fight without any mechanics to help with that fact. Trust me when I say there's no environment to use to your advantage when in the void of darkness. And just when you think this boss couldn't possibly get any worse, they went and threw in a grab attack that steals your humanity. Hello? That's my precious resource that you're munching on. I would prefer if you didn't take that. Seath has a few minor annoyances of his own, starting with the bizarre oversight that additional enemies can somehow make their way into the arena. Once you've dispatched of the clams, you now have to deal with Seath's barrage of curse build-up. After all, there's nothing more enjoyable than an instant kill status effect that halves your health bar upon respawning. It's so great, I think every boss should have it. Nito is perhaps the most tolerable of the four, but he is heavily RNG dependent. The entire difficulty of this fight hinges on how frequently he chooses to nuke all of his skeleton minions. If you're lucky, he'll do it enough to where you never feel like you're being unfairly ganged up on. If you're unlucky, he can sometimes go the entire fight without doing it. Better pray that you're not unlucky. So yeah, it's nice to know that the four big boy bosses of this game are all incredibly flawed in their own gimmicky ways. What about the final boss? How does he hold up? Well, you see, Gwyn has this unhealthy habit of bending space-time in order to prevent you from healing. If he gets so much of a whiff of your Estus Flask, he will change trajectory mid-air to curve around any obstacle in his way and knock you out of that healing animation before you can blink. I have never understood why they put pillars in this room to begin with when the boss seems so insistent on ignoring them to the point of bending gravity to his very will. Okay, well, how about the game's myriad of demon boss fights? Asylum Demon is a tutorial boss that somehow has less moves in his moveset than you do at the time of fighting him, and yet they still insisted on copying and pasting him not once, but twice.
God, you are killing me with that booty.
Taurus Demon can be easily baited into jumping off the bridge and killing himself, and Capra Demon isn't even the real boss of his own arena, it's the two regular-ass dogs they decided to shove in with him. Moving on down to Demon Town, the Ceaseless Discharge will certainly walk towards you very menacingly, but he fails to be any more threatening when you prick his finger and he instantly falls backwards to his death. It's so laughable that nobody can even tell whether this is a glitch or if it's actually intentional. The Centipede Demon is an actually good boss fight with a crazy moveset, although you'll never notice this fact on a first playthrough because the fight takes place on a tiny slither of rock surrounded by a lava pool that will instantly melt you upon touch. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that the demon fights leave a little bit to be desired. I suppose Chaos Witch Quelaag can fill that desire if you're willing to look past a bit of area denial. Overall, this is one of the better fights in the game, but it does contain what I like to call the get the fuck out of my face attack. This kind of attack is something that Dark Souls 1 seems to really love, and although this is a more personal preference of mine, I've never really seen the appeal of having to run directly away from the boss to avoid a big fuck off explosion. Anyways, this boss is fine, let's find some others that we can point and laugh at. Pinwheel has been a frequent source of laughter among the Dark Souls community because of how unbelievably easy he is, and the only real challenge that the Gaping Dragon poses is the challenge of not falling asleep from the boredom. I especially love how over half the Iron Golem fight consists of him falling over like an idiot and then sitting there on his fat ass for 2 whole minutes. But if you want to talk about threatening bosses that really keep you on your toes, then you should have a look at the Moonlight Butterfly, because this boss fight is the perfect example of what not to do when trying to make a threatening boss. The entire gameplay loop of this fight is you dodge a bunch of really weak spells for about 2 minutes, and then the boss just keels over and lets you hit it for over half its health bar, and then you just repeat that unengaging cycle all over again until it's done. And let's not forget our other unforgettable optional bosses like Corridor Running Simulator and I don't know, she kind of just disappeared. There's nothing more engaging than perpetually chasing my enemy down a never-ending hallway and then getting one-shot by a bunch of insanely high damage magic spam. Wait, hang on a second. I think I just showed footage for the wrong boss. There we go, it's all fixed now. Needless to say, Dark Souls 1's bosses leave a lot to be desired. Obviously, it's foolish of me to expect the same level of quality that Dark Souls 3 offers with its fights, but that doesn't make this game's bosses any less gimmicky, unintuitive, and unengaging. And to speak purely subjectively for just a moment, I don't like these bosses. They're bad. They're clunky, boring, and riddled with mechanics that have no place in a Souls game like this. There's no place in Dark Souls 1 for a parkour challenge, or a DPS test, or a bullet hell. Many of these bosses from a design standpoint directly contradict the established gameplay of Dark Souls, and an even longer list of them are just boring. Don't get me wrong, there are still some fantastic boss fights in this game, but they're rare. Speaking honestly, there just aren't enough bosses in this game to warrant so many of them being bad. As a closing, I want to make the purpose of this video clear just one more time. You may think that throughout the course of this rather long venture that I may have let slip my true feelings on this game, but that assumption couldn't be any further from the truth. The ultimate goal of this video was to critique Dark Souls 1 in order to firmly establish it as something less than perfect. Over the years, there has always been an idea floating around that this game represents the golden standard for the genre, and I suppose my motivation for making this critique was to put that sentiment to rest. That's the truth of it. My goals are not quite as malicious as tearing this game down to put another one in its place. Yes, I do feel that over the years that have passed since Dark Souls 1, From Software have put out works that dwarf it in overall quality, but I did my best to make sure that those thoughts and feelings never once factored into how I wrote the arguments found in this video. In truth, there is a lot more that I have to say on this topic. I could have rambled on about the game's horrible lighting and colour scheme, or its less than optimal inventory system. I could have spoken more on resistance as a stat, or the game's convoluted system for weapon upgrades. In the end, I chose to throw these topics out for the sake of keeping my arguments more grounded in objectivity. Does that mean I've been completely unbiased throughout this entire video? No, of course it doesn't. In conclusion, Dark Souls 1 is a good game with flaws. A lot of flaws. That fact doesn't change no matter how much nostalgia you have for it. Over half the game was seemingly rushed and thrown together at the last minute. The movement is old and outdated, and build diversity is severely damaged by item balancing, as well as a reliance on a particular stat. The second half of the game provides the player with great freedom, whilst forgetting to compensate for this with proper difficulty balancing. The equip weight stat serves as a shackle for the player, whilst the existence of humanity and bonfire kindling does nothing but contradict the way healing was intended to work. Sure, the game is a wonderfully interconnected world, but what difference does secret unlocked doors and passageways between new and old areas really make when you're required to ring both bells of awakening regardless? The game is still linear. That fact doesn't change all because there's a stinky backdoor sewage gate that connects Bumville and Pooh Town. I wouldn't be making this video if I didn't love this game. I personally wouldn't have the patience to spend 2 years putting together a video on a topic that I'm not extremely passionate about. Yes, you heard me perfectly. This video has been in the work for over 2 years at this point, and the fact that I managed to get it to you now after so much procrastination is a sign that I've gone through hell to finish this project. Between 7 total redrafts of the script I am now reading from, as well as months of editing and 3 total playthroughs of Dark Souls 1 for the purposes of further research and gathering footage, the construction of this video has been a long and grueling task. Thank you so much for bearing with me while I hyped this thing up for years without any sign of its existence. Anyways, I'm being a bit hyperbolic, of course. The process may be tiring, but at the end of the day, it's always fun to see these things in finished form. I would say everything was well worth it if not for the dread in my heart that this video will never even reach its intended audience. If you enjoy my content and wish to see it do well, then I strongly encourage you to share this video with others. Liking this video and subscribing to my channel will certainly help with my confidence and my motivation to keep going, but if you really want to help me in the long term, then there is nothing I would welcome more than a constructive comment. Despite the effort that went into it, this video is not perfect. Whether you agree or disagree with the arguments I've made today, I would really love to engage in a discussion with you all about this game and others like it. Thank you all so much for watching, and I promise the next video won't be so long. Until next time, see ya.